Welcome to the Estate Made Simple podcast with Jenna and Gordon Vanderleek. We are on a mission to simplify the world of estate administration, helping executors gain the knowledge required to manage an estate. Please note, the following is for informational purposes only and is not to be considered legal, tax, or financial advice. We recommend you seek individualized advice for your unique situation with qualified professionals.
Welcome to another episode of Estates Made Simple. This is always a highlight on my calendar, Jenna. I hope it is for you as well, but you don't have to answer that question. Let me just believe that you enjoy these sessions. I do, genuinely. I was just thinking it is genuinely a fun part of my hectic schedule to take a break and say, I get to talk to Jenna about all things estate administration and helping to simplify estates. That's our mission here. We want to give good information, not legal advice or professional advice, but we want to steer executors and administrators in the right direction. And today's topic, we're going to be extending beyond our own borders and thinking about cross-border assets or international assets, property in other jurisdictions. And what in the world should an executor or administrator start thinking about in those circumstances? And I think the trend I see in this area, Jenna, is that more and more people are acquiring property in different jurisdictions. We had a scenario where somebody immigrated a number of years ago into Canada, was establishing their life here, but they came not as a young person, but later in life, and they had property accumulated in that other jurisdiction, which they continued to own. They didn't want to give it up. It's okay, you got to deal with that. It might be that a child inherits a property from a parent, whether it's a vacation property or something that was passed down through the generations, or property that was acquired later in life. The other day, somebody was talking to me about, they wanted to retire to Portugal, which I thought was a lovely idea. But what if you owned a property in Portugal and then you pass away and you're handing this estate to an executor? What in the world do you do with that? So that's what we want to talk about. I've given examples of real estate, and that's where you commonly think of it, but it could also be bank accounts, various investments. People may have pension assets and or other financial property that's part of their worldwide estate that needs to be managed and dealt with. And seeing property cross-border is becoming more and more commonplace. So we thought this was a good topic to talk about with our listeners and our viewers.
Absolutely. And you're right about families acquiring more property as time goes on, because we are seeing a lot more estates with complex assets, whether it be corporately held assets or assets in other jurisdictions. And so I think this is a very timely discussion. And when we're thinking about assets that are outside of the country, I think the restrictions or maybe the complexity falls into three buckets. One, a legal bucket. You need to deal with different legal parameters. A tax or financial bucket. There's obviously different tax rules in those jurisdictions. And then we come across the logistical bucket. How do you actually handle the asset? Do you need to travel to deal with it? So I'm going to talk first about the legal component, because I think one of the first considerations the executor should think about is this asset in the other country actually part of the estate? The asset might be held in joint names, which could mean that it passes outside of the estate, or there could be forced heirship rules in that other jurisdiction that forces that asset to a specific beneficiary or class of beneficiaries that are outside of the rules of the will in which the executor is administering. So I think that's the first thing to really think about. If the asset is part of the estate, then my first job, if I was an executor today, would be to find a legal expert in that jurisdiction that can handle the complexity and advising me in how to deal with that asset. So they can advise on the probate laws. What sort of probate document do they need? Would they accept an Alberta probate resealed in that jurisdiction? Or do you need to do a whole process all over again? So there's different ways and different routes to take in that regard. They can also advise you on the timing with respect to transferring that asset to the estate. And that could also help you in your communications with beneficiaries. Timing is a huge component. And then lastly, I think a lawyer would really be able to connect you with other professionals that you may need to help you deal sufficiently with that asset, whether it be accounting or a real estate property manager, that sort of thing.
And if there's investment accounts, then you need to be mindful of ongoing investment responsibilities for those assets, right? I mean, if
Absolutely.
there's stocks and bonds and mutual funds, and there's a whole bunch of advice there if there's some cash assets in that country. I like what you said in terms of focusing on that legal bucket. So it's, I think, a strong recommendation saying, number one, your lawyer, assuming you hire somebody in Alberta, they can give you advice in Alberta law, but they won't be able to give you advice in another jurisdiction. They're not trained on that. They're not licensed in that area. So you just need to get a professional. I think there is enough complexity. I don't think this is a scenario where type the question into Chat GPT and get an answer and rely on that. That's not going to work. I really like your idea too about leveraging the network of that professional. And maybe you're starting with the accountant and you're asking a referral for a lawyer, or you're starting with the lawyer and say, how about a good accountant, or what about a realtor who would be there? So somebody, I think you want to pick somebody who's in kind of the local jurisdiction, because there may also be some municipal rules or a local city rule that would be relevant, for example, with real estate. And you may want to be ensuring that you're complying with those rules when you're disposing or dealing with those assets, right? If there's certain inspections required or a permit or something is relevant for your control and or ultimate ownership, or the ownership for the beneficiaries in that estate, you have to make sure you're covering yourself and you're protected. Because if you make an assumption, oh, I'm the beneficiary of the estate, of course that's where it goes. Maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe it goes somewhere else. As you say, the forced heirship rules, or it's divided between spouse and kids when maybe the will says everything to spouse. There could be all sorts of considerations there that are relevant. You need some local protection. So that's a really good recommendation on that. What about that second bucket, the accounting bucket? What are some thoughts there?
Yeah, I think hiring someone who's qualified and can work with your accountant here in Canada to ensure that certain treaty benefits are realized and that the tax returns go hand in hand. If you do it in silos and if the accountants don't speak, then you could be missing out on some benefits. So I would recommend, yes, get an expert in that jurisdiction, as well as an expert that will be able to work with your accountant here in Canada to ensure you're not paying more tax than you need to.
The one thing I think that's important when you're looking at foreign-based property is to recognize that executors here in Canada, specifically in Alberta, will report to Canada Revenue Agency regarding the estate and tax implications relating to the death of the property owner. So in Canada, you have to report your worldwide estate. So there may very well be a requirement to pay tax on this foreign property in Canada. Now, hopefully there might be a tax treaty. So just be aware, I guess, for our listeners, that often, especially for the major countries, there may very well be a tax treaty in place that provides some relief. What if you pay tax in Canada, you have a credit in the other jurisdiction, but you want to find out in that other jurisdiction, notwithstanding you have to file here and report it, doesn't mean you don't have to file there, right?
Yeah.
That's important to be aware of. And while there may be capital gains here and a tax implication, there may be unique laws in place. A lot of countries have an inheritance tax, and that might be applicable notwithstanding what the will says or what the wishes of the deceased were, that on death, the government may say, we take a percentage of the property in our jurisdiction. And that's not probate fees, but that's just straight inheritance tax. I know, for example, the UK, they do have an inheritance tax. If you own property in the US, you've got to deal with those rules and potential filings with the IRS. So it's a ton of liability if you don't do it right. So it just is a really easy recommendation, and one we can make strongly, to say you just need to protect yourself, because if you miss those rules, that's personal liability. And they're going to go, how come you didn't file? And the answer is not, I wasn't aware of that. You have to get the advice. You have to go. So I think on that accounting side, making sure you're reporting the disposition of those assets and figuring out what's involved with that. Maybe you need valuation, then not only who's going to be the beneficiary, the forced heirship you referenced, but also what are the tax implication in that jurisdiction on there. Maybe this is a good point just to interject the comment, looking at it from a planning perspective. We're focused on the estate administration issue, but it is appropriate. And from time to time in my practice, we've seen situations where people, in fact, want to do some planning for that jurisdiction, to create a will that's customized for the laws of that jurisdiction so their wishes do get carried out. They might have a local executor has the knowledge and the ability to make good decisions, to be able to work in that, to be appointed in that area rather than the executor who's here in Canada. That would save a lot of travel costs and all the rest of it. So those are important consideration, because dealing with property in another jurisdiction right away it would be, oh, I guess I got to get on a plane. I got to get over there and figure things out. You might have to inspect the property. You have to secure the property, change the locks. Is the roof leaking on the house, right? What about the investments? Are they secure? Do the person have a credit card over there, or do I need to cancel that? What if they owned a vehicle and that's parked in the garage in the car? Is it insured? All those things, the normal questions have to be applied, probably means taking time off work and spending some time in that jurisdiction, meeting with professionals and the like. So just be aware of it. And in some cases, you can do some planning to mitigate the costs associated with somebody having to manage property in a foreign jurisdiction by picking somebody there. Years ago, I was involved in a situation where somebody was planning for property in a state in the US. Interestingly, they were down there for a period of time for work, but they had one kid down there and one kid in Alberta here in Calgary. So we had their Canadian will, or their Alberta-based will, appointing that person, but the will that they had a local lawyer help to draft, and that we, as lawyers, we coordinated the terminology and the terms of those wills so they could coexist. We had the kid who was down there be the one who was the executor of that property. That made imminent sense, right? To say we have two buckets of assets and we are going to have two different people that happen to work out quite nicely just based on where the kids were living, to have that as the plan. But just use that by way of an example. That's not to suggest you can only do planning for multiple jurisdictions if you have kids in that jurisdiction, but just it illustrates that plan made sense in that circumstance. So if you're listening to this and you're going to go, wait a minute, I own property in jurisdictions in other countries, maybe I should get some advice on how to plan for that to make the work of my executor that much easier, which will speed up the administration of the estate and save costs.
And I think you touched on that last bucket that we mentioned at the beginning, is the logistics point of view. What makes most sense in terms of managing the estate? Does somebody need to travel to deal with that specific asset, or can you hire someone locally, as you mentioned, whether it be appointing a different executor or maybe hiring a local agent to help with the special needs of that asset? And as a final tip, I will say, when you're dealing with assets out of the country, make sure that any administrative matter or any sort of tax is fully dealt with before distributing assets of the estate. I know we've talked about before with respect to a clearance certificate in Canada. A clearance certificate gives the executor some surety that CRA is not going to ask the executor for more money in terms of tax expense. But other countries may not have the equivalent of a clearance certificate. So how does an executor protect itself? One, they could maybe wait a period of time for the limitation period to pass. Maybe there's other documents that may provide some protection. Maybe there is a release that the beneficiary sign, but any sort of liability that's hanging out in those jurisdictions, the executor should be mindful of before doing distributions from the estate.
I'm thinking as I'm listening to that, all those are good tips. We regularly talk to executors here in Alberta about notice to creditors, right? It's an option you can advertise to provide some protection, and our Estate Administration Act provides some protection when you notify the public that you're ready to do a distribution and people need to come forward with their claims. You could have a situation where it doesn't really make sense to do that here in Canada or in the local paper, say in Calgary, where we live, but it may make imminent sense for property in another jurisdiction, because how do you know the kind of whatever arrangements are there? So getting some advice from the local lawyer of how do I protect myself? So I guess adding to the list could be, maybe you would advertise there in the local paper if that measure under those local laws gave you the type of protection that you might have had you done it. So just because you're deciding, that's an example of saying the analysis of what makes sense in Alberta may not make sense. It may be a different analysis, a different conclusion for this other country. And that gets back to our opening comments. You just need professional advice on this.
Right.
You can't rely on what the internet's serving up, but do get the advice. That's the protection, right? That's the way you're going to make sure you're doing your job properly and you've considered all the various implications. You can't rely on what the local estate lawyer is saying when you're thinking about the laws of a different jurisdiction. So that's a good takeaway. To maybe some tips about, like you say, retaining an agent. You need documents translated. What about translation services? There's all sorts of things Does the person have a passport in that jurisdiction? Did they have a credit card? How do you deal with all that stuff? Or various legal documents. You need an opinion about, what do I do with this? Getting advice on legitimate debts that you have to resolve. Is this something the estate has to deal with? So you want somebody who's conversant in this area and help you through navigating that process. I guess the final comment would be, if you know you're being asked to be an executor, these are things you want to talk about with the person ahead of time to say, do I have all the information? Because there's some unique considerations. Let's have a conversation about that. Or if you're planning your own estate and you have these, maybe a detailed memo to the file of, here's the people to use, here's what's involved, here's everything I have out there. Start with a list. Do what you can for your executor to minimize their time and expense would be an excellent first step on a practical basis if you own property in other jurisdictions. But again, if this is something where you're an executor and you're faced with these issues, feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to help you work through that or see if we can help to find some referrals in a particular jurisdiction to make things work a little bit easier.
Well, thanks for those comments, Gord, and thank you to everyone listening today. We hope we haven't scared you out of your role of an executor, because there's always a path forward. You just need to know where to go. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you next time. Take care.